Well, thank you again very much for your welcome. Let me say I've really enjoyed being here in the past few days, and I want to congratulate all those who put up their hands and said that you had been here for all three, and there's a third one. That's real, shows a lot of stamina, staying power, and perseverance, and something else maybe. Now, normally I just spend the first few seconds telling stories while we just wait for the slide to come up, and let's just wait and see. Now, I could press this button here, and there we go. That's wonderful. Okay. As you've noticed in the title this evening, we're coming to a subject that's really exercised theologians and philosophers and everybody else really for many, many centuries. Although I have to say the character of the discussion has changed considerably with the passing of the years. For students of analytical philosophy, the topic is a familiar one. It's used often as a method for sharpening analytical philosophy debating skills. Theologians, meanwhile, are interested in justifying the ways of God to humankind. And for the rest of us, I think the topic simply won't go away as we ponder on the vast amount of pain, suffering, and death that has characterized the evolutionary process and that continues to impact us in our daily lives. How could it be that a God of love could bring about such a vast array of biological diversity, including ourselves, by a process involving so much pain and death, a process indeed in which 99% or more of all the species that ever lived have gone extinct? It might be helpful if we start this evening by summarizing the main themes already covered in the first two lectures, just for those who weren't here the first couple of nights, as in fact these provide the particular theological context in which I'm going to be addressing my remarks this evening. So in the first lecture, I mapped out the framework of a traditional Christian theology within which the discipline of biology can and does flourish. This is a Trinitarian creation theology in which God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit are all intimately involved in the ongoing process of the created order, past, present, and future. God is the author of creation, causing things to be causes, thereby providing the created order with its own functional integrity, within which the evolutionary process plays a critical role in his purposes. And then in the second lecture yesterday, moving from this theology of nature to a mild kind of form of natural theology, we considered the atheist claim that the evolutionary process is necessarily one without purpose. We countered that claim by showing the many different ways in which evolution displays stringent constraints, guaranteeing that only certain things will happen and not others. Taken overall, we claimed evolution is not a chance or random process and is consistent with a God who has intentions and purposes for the world in general and for humankind in particular. Now, with such a theological matrix in mind, it will already be clear that the challenge of the pain and suffering involved in the evolutionary process is a pressing one. Indeed, there are many theologians and philosophers who have moved away from the kind of traditional creation theology that I have outlined, precisely because it appears to them that too much blame thereby attaches to God, the author of creation, and such a scenario should somehow be avoided. Now, if you find something you don't like in a book, then you only have the author to blame. I actually happen to think that inference is exactly right, but if I might say so without sounding disrespectful, I think God is well able to look after himself in this respect. And I hope by the end of this lecture we will see how it is actually the evolutionary process itself that helps us to see that the evils it entails, if evils they indeed are at least not gratuitous evils, but rather play a key role in the larger purposes of God. But first of all, I want to make three preliminary observations. There's always a danger in considering such matters in a rather dry and academic way, the way we're going to look at this evening, that the discussion might seem callous to someone here this evening who themselves are going through some period of suffering, or maybe somebody who is close to them might be doing the same. Laura Ekstrom has some wise advice in her recent essay in the Blackwell Companion to the Problem of Evil, writing, and I quote, that I still do think that the best way for a Christian, and indeed any person, to respond to those who suffer is with compassion, which can both prompt actions that bring practical relief and bring comfort to the psyche. Alleged divine justifications, on the other hand, are often the last thing a suffering person needs to hear. With respect to offering theodicies to those enduring pain and loss, just shut up remains, to my mind, decent advice. Well, I think wise words indeed. And yet, to tackle these issues when we are not in the midst of some period of suffering is also wise. And personally, I have to say that in any case, I draw great personal comfort from the emphasis that we're going to be considering this evening. Maybe it's because I'm a biologist, but there is much, I think, in the theodicy that we're going to be considering from which we can draw both comfort and assurance. I sincerely hope that's the case. The second preliminary point that I want to make concerns definitions. It's customary in these discussions to make a distinction between the moral evils that arise out of our own possession of free will and the so-called natural evils, such as pain, cancer, and earthquakes, that are integral properties of the created order. Now, this evening, we're going to be focusing on the natural evils that arise from the evolutionary process. Clearly, these are not evil in the first sense, since no moral decision-making is entailed, but I think theologically we are justified in calling these items evil in the rather specialized sense in which they clearly do not belong to the ultimate fulfilled kingdom of God, in which God's reign will be finally vindicated. When Jesus came teaching and preaching the kingdom of God, he clearly saw sickness as an evil to be confronted on the grounds that it had no place in God's fulfilled kingdom. And so natural evil is ultimately unnatural evil because it does not belong in the age which is to come, even though it is very much part of our own experience now in the present evil age. And even if we don't want to attach the word evil to such characteristics of the created order at all, we can, I think, at least all agree that they represent facets of creation that we would much rather do without. My third preliminary point relates to the word theodicy. And I insert this point for those philosophers here who wish to keep their terminology neat and tidy. The term theodicy derives from the famous book of that name, written by the great philosopher and mathematician Gottfried Leibniz, and published in 1710. In recent years, and especially since the groundbreaking work of Alan Alpandiger in this area, published in 1974, it's been customary to define a theodicy as an argument that purports to offer God's actual reasons for permitting evil, while a defense merely purports to offer possible reasons. However, I think it's fair to say that even professional philosophers are not totally agreed upon the precise definition of the word theodicy. So instead of worrying too much about the terminology, let me instead quote from an atheist, David Hull, writing a book review in the scientific journal Nature way back in 1992, and I quote. He writes, "What kind of God can one infer from the sort of phenomena epitomized by the species on Darwin's Galapagos Islands? The evolutionary process is rife with happenstance, contingency, incredible waste, death, pain, and horror. Whatever the God implied by evolutionary theory and the data of natural selection may be like, he is not the Protestant God of waste not, want not. He is also not the loving God who cares about his productions. He is not even the awful God pictured in the book of Job. The God of the Galapagos is careless, wasteful, indifferent, almost diabolical. He is certainly not the sort of God to whom anyone would be inclined to pray." Close quote. Pretty clear statement. So, as a Darwinian and as a Christian, my definition of theodicy this evening refers to those various responses that as Christians we might wish to make to such a claim, noting, of course, that David Hull thinks that one can read off, as it were, the character of God by studying the natural world, itself a problematic assumption to say the least. And the range of Christian responses is indeed a huge one. Indeed, one can rather easily predict the form of the religious response once the starting theological position is known, in particular the understanding of what it means to say that God the Creator is omnipotent. So this figure illustrates the spectrum of theological positions concerning God's omnipotence. At the left extreme pole, God is not really omnipotent at all. At the right extreme pole, God determines every event without exception. And I think in practice all theologies can be located somewhere along this spectrum. But for eve of discussion this evening, I've kind of put 3 circles there to typify, represent the left side, the middle side, and the right side, without, by the way, intending any political meaning at all in these particular circles that we're putting there. Okay, as an example then of circle A, we can take process theology. I'll be coming back to this figure now and again, so don't worry if you haven't read it all. We'll be coming back and revisiting it from time to time. Let's look then at the left-hand side. Here we have an example of a circle A theology, process theology, which suggests that the evils of the world are explained basically by God's non-omnipotence, often defended by its proponents on the grounds that it does a better job at theodicy than traditional theism. So James Keller writes in his essay in the Blackwell Companion to the Problem of Evil that, and I quote, "Because I believe that none of the responses by traditional Christian theists are adequate, I propose process theism as a better way to respond to the problems of evil," close quote. And so within the process theology popularized by Ian Whitehead, God cannot unilaterally bring about any particular state of affairs in the universe, but instead can, using Whitehead's term, lure the universe to behave in ways that he might wish. In fact, God has the maximum power of any actual being, but he's unable to guarantee that his lure will be followed in this view, and indeed, in many cases, it isn't, hence explaining the evils in the world. And so in process theology, God becomes but one component amongst many in influencing the future course of the universe. And so representatives of Circle A, and there are many others as well, seek to solve the problem of evil by basically denying God's omnipotence altogether. And I'm actually not going to be spending any more time on that circle this evening, as to me at any rate it just seems too far from what I read about my Creator God in the pages of Scripture. But what about Circle B, the one right in the middle there? Here we find a large cluster of commentators. Many of them are well-known figures in the science religion field who insist on God's omnipotence, but who also suggest that God has deliberately chosen to restrict his omnipotence in order to allow the created order to be itself and, in a sense, express its own freedom. So the theologian Jack Haupt, for example, focuses particularly on the theological notion of kenosis, of God letting the creation be itself out of love. And I quote from Jack here, willing to risk the disorder and deviation that actually occur in the evolution of cosmic beauty. Many other writers represent this middle circle with various nuanced positions, including Arthur Peacock, John Polkinghorne, Keith Ward, Holmes Rolston, amongst others. W.H. Vanston speaks of God's activity in creation, in which each step is a precarious step into the unknown. And so the perceived advantage for constructing a coherent theodicy is, of course, that now God is no longer directly responsible for the ills of the created order, but instead its disorder and deviation, to use Jack Haupt's phrase, is a consequence of giving creation its freedom to develop. And in her recent book, which came out actually earlier this year, Ask the Beasts, Darwin and the God of Love, Elizabeth Johnson adopts a similar line. Just as God bestows free will upon humans, so he also bestows free process upon the natural world. The world, writes Johnson, is gifted with its own freedom in and through which the Creator Spirit's gracious purpose is accomplished. Evolutionary biology is therefore an unscripted adventure in which the natural world freely participates in its own creation and, again using her own words here, free process in nature works in ways not necessarily always according to divine design. Now, there are many variants again within Circle B, and here's another variant where the focus is placed less on kenosis, more on the autonomy of the evolutionary process itself, so that it is not really God's fault that the process involves so much death and suffering. It's evolution's fault. So the evolutionary biologist Francisco Ayala writes, and I quote, that a major burden was removed from the shoulder of believers when convincing evidence was advanced that the design of organisms need not be attributed to the immediate agency of the Creator, but rather is an outcome of natural processes, close quote. I think here we have a view that tends more somewhat in the direction of deism, in which God creates the laws that define the properties of the world, and then basically the world proceeds according to those laws. Indeed, this seems to have been Darwin's own theological position at the time when he was writing The Origin of Species, although, like many of Darwin's positions, there's some ambiguity about that. Now, I want to suggest that there are three particular problems. I value very much these friends of mine, many of them friends of mine in position B, but I think there are some problems that we need to think about as well, and I want to highlight just three of those problems. The first is that the material created order is not really free to do anything. Matter does what matter does. It's not free even in the metaphorical sense intended by these commentators, I would suggest. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle might make the behavior of matter indeterminate from a human perspective, but it does not thereby become free. Freedom, as far as I can see, makes sense as a term applied to human decision-making, but it makes no sense as a way of describing the material world around us. Now, if one wishes to emphasize, of course, that the created order has its own functional integrity, as we did during Lecture 1, then that's a different matter. And the neo-Thomist position espoused in that lecture emphasizes the very real causal efficacy of secondary causes that operate in clear distinction to God as primary cause. But especially when we consider the reproducibility and to some extent even predictability of the evolutionary process, as we were considering in our lecture yesterday, then free process does not seem to be the most appropriate description of the biological realities that we actually observe. I think the second problem comes with the use of the word kenosis to describe God's supposed self-imposed restriction on his own omnipotence in allowing creation to be itself. Now, of course, kenosis has a well-established theological meaning based on Philippians chapter 2, in which the incarnation entails Christ leaving the glories of heaven and making himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. But that's not at all like the way in which the Bible describes God's actions in creation. As we were noting in the first lecture, it is the metaphor of God speaking that the Bible uses most often when describing God's creative work. God speaks in Genesis 1, and things happen. Jesus speaks to the waves on the stormy sea, and the storm is stilled. And there's never a hint in such passages that these words of command entail any self-emptying on God's part. Rather, the opposite. Creation for God doesn't seem to entail any effort at all as far as Scripture is concerned. So I'm reminded of the late Colin Gunton's comment in his book, The Triune God, that there is no suggestion in the Bible that the act of creation is anything but the joyful giving of reality to the other. The third and most important problem, I think, with the Circle B positions is that a hands-off God who allows the free process of his creation to have an unscripted adventure in which the outcomes are uncertain is still just as responsible for the evil and suffering in the world as a God who determines the created order down to its very smallest detail. I take my hands off the steering wheel as my car goes down the hill, and it then proceeds to crash into the sidewalk, killing a child. I'm just as culpable as if I'd killed a child with my hands still firmly on the steering wheel. The hands-off free process God provides, I think, no real answer to the problem of evil and suffering entailed by evolutionary history. So I want now to move over to the Circle C proponents towards the right of our spectrum. And this circle represents the most robust expression of God's omnipotence that highlights God's faithfulness in both creating and sustaining the properties of matter, properties which, as a matter of fact, do perfectly fulfill his intentions and purposes. There is therefore no room in this view for kenosis in the context of God's creative work, because God is in no sense denying his own nature or emptying himself in the creative process. At the same time, God is not the puppet master, micromanaging the created order, but the God who operates via secondary causes that have their own causal efficacy. Those who are present for the first lecture in this series will be aware that it is within Circle C that my own theology is located. This is a robust Trinitarian theism which takes the problem of natural evil right on the chin, fair and square. There's no ducking the issue. God really is responsible for God's created order. How could it be otherwise in the proponents, amongst the proponents there of Circle C? So then, if that's the case, what is the overriding good that is generated by a world with these particular properties in which the death, pain, and predation are part and parcel? I would like to suggest that it is coherent existence itself which is the overriding good, including the existence of living things, and most especially the existence of creatures like ourselves with a capacity to respond freely to God's love. The existence of anything of any interest is only feasible within the framework of gnomic regularity, that is, the law-like behavior of the properties of matter that reflects the faithfulness of God in sustaining the created order moment by moment. Without that gnomic regularity, there would be, of course, no universe. There would be no life. There would be no reproducibility of the properties of matter. There would be no science. There would be no ethics. There would be no moral decision-making, because the outcome of the decision would be random. And indeed, there would be no relationships, and certainly no coherent worship of the living God. In other words, without gnomic regularity, there would be no coherent existence at all. But coherent, meaningful existence of living things in particular comes at a cost. And to see what that cost looks like, we only have to look at the world of biology. Of course, there's nothing new in making that particular observation. Already in the 19th century, we find Asa Gray, professor of natural history at Harvard University, writing to Darwin from Harvard and arguing that animal and human pain are not features of nature to be deplored, but rather necessary concomitants of the creative process. Asa Gray, as you might know, was a committed Christian and the one who helped to see The Origin of Species published here in the United States. After more than a century of further biological research, we're now in a far stronger position to appreciate just how prescient were Gray's insights. Imagine, for example, a giant table, of which a small portion is shown here, in which all the positive aspects of the biology of living things are lined up on one side of the table. Positive, that is, in the sense that they contribute to the life and well-being of the organism. We could pick eating, or the mutations that are required for our individuality and for the proper functioning of our immune systems. Or we could pick apoptosis, the programmed cell death that is essential for normal development and for protecting our bodies against cancer. Or we could pick the fact that our own bodies contain 10 times more bacteria than the number of our own cells, contributing significantly to our health and well-being. But whatever we pick, we find that there is a debit side also to the very same item. So eating results in an increased production of free oxygen radicals that can lead to mutations and to cancer. Mutations that are essential for our very existence, because evolution depends on them, can also cause genetic diseases that can kill us. The programmed cell death that is essential for normal brain development can also be a root cause of cancer when its regulation goes wrong. And yes, good bacteria are good for us, but bad bacteria, of course, can also kill us. So being alive, at least as far as carbon-based life is concerned, is a package deal. Whatever plus you might pick in the table will also have a minus in the big scheme of things. Now, if we eventually find life on other planets, which seems rather likely, I think, will it also be carbon-based life? All we know of the chemistry and biochemistry of the universe at present suggests that this indeed will be the case. Whichever way we look in the universe, it's just full of carbon compounds, some of them actually quite complex. Around 200 different compounds, mostly organic, have already been identified in the so-called dense molecular clouds of outer space. And these include large molecules such as the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, anthracene and naphthalene, contains also two types of fullerene, C60 and C70. Fullerene is any molecule composed entirely of carbon, and the terms C60 and C70 simply means that these represent structures containing 60 and 70 atoms of carbon respectively. And because space is so huge, the actual amounts of these organic compounds in space are likewise huge, so that the mass of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons detectable in space has been estimated to be much higher than the total mass of biological materials here on planet Earth. And since the carbon-based chemistry of the universe does look so dominant everywhere we look, and since the combining power of carbon in comparison with elements such as silicon does seem to give it some clear advantages in generating the building blocks of life, it does seem very likely that if and when we find life on other planets, it will be carbon-based life. The elements that are essential for life, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and so on, they're all synthesized in exploding stars and supernovae in which the temperatures attained provide sufficient energy to drive their synthesis. And as these stars become exploding supernovae, so their components are scattered through space there eventually to undergo the accretion necessary to form the next solar systems that will be rich with anthropic possibilities. And that reflection then brings us to the top line of our great giant table, which we haven't mentioned yet. Life on one side of the table entails death on the other. Carbon-based life is impossible without carbon-based death. No multicellular animal can live by deriving all its energy needs from chemical elements. All are completely dependent on the food chain whereby organic molecules synthesized in other organisms are passed on to them. Now, plants can, of course, derive at least some of their nutritional needs from the sun by photosynthesis, but that comes at the cost of not being able to move around, not very much anyway. And it comes at the cost of not having a brain, because brains are very costly in energetic terms. Think about that yesterday. 25% of our own energy as adults is consumed by our brains. Now, large trees can generate huge amounts of energy by means of their photosynthesizing leaf area, but in the case of this 33-foot high Californian oak tree, that entails around 2,000 square feet of leaf, a huge area. And so the tree is stationary. It has no brain, it has no relationships. If you want to generate organisms with language, mobility, consciousness, relationships, social organization, then you need a complex nervous system and you need a big brain to go with it. And energetically, that just doesn't come cheap. It requires a food chain in which complex carbon molecules are synthesized in other organisms that might be getting their energy from the sun and then consumed by the bearer of the brain by eating. And death is also part of the carbon-based life package deal because, of course, it is death that makes space for the next generation. And I think it's good to be reminded of the huge scale of biological death on our planet. The 10 to the 14 bacteria that inhabit our own bodies are as nothing compared to the estimated 5 times 10 to the 30 bacteria in the world, more than 92% of those living underground, weighing roughly equivalent to all the plants in the world. That's certainly a lot more than the 10 to the 22 stars in the universe, and it entails a huge amount of daily death. And if you don't care very much about bacterial death, then just think of the roughly 155,000 human deaths every day, or nearly 108 per minute. I call this my cheerful slide. The dead are constantly making space for the living on planet Earth. If it were not so, the planet would run out of space and resources in a very short space of time. Death is written into the package deal. And in the very early microseconds after the Big Bang, the physical laws were emerging that define the properties of the chemical elements that comprise the periodic table. And it is the properties of the elements in the periodic table that define the properties of life. Carbon-based life and carbon-based death were written already into the anthropic script of the universe right from the beginning. And physical death is, of course, also central to the evolutionary history that has enabled our own existence. Because of the package deal of carbon-based life, this is a slow process. Ever since the so-called Cambrian explosion, about 500 million years ago, nervous systems have been developing in more complex directions. And since our own last common ancestor with a chimpanzee around 6 million years ago, hominin brain size has roughly quadrupled in size, one of the most dramatic changes to occur in mammalian evolutionary history. Yet 6 million years is still a very long time compared to the time span of a single human life. This long process of evolutionary history is part, I would suggest, of the package deal of carbon-based life. It could be no other. The gradual genomic changes and the subsequent natural selection of the resulting variant phenotypes takes time. It takes lots of time. And during this long period of time, many trillions of living creatures experience pain and die. Indeed, pain is a further key aspect of the carbon-based package deal of life. Pain is an essential property of biological life, especially as nervous systems become more developed. All organisms, even single-celled organisms like bacteria and yeast, have mechanisms for sensing their environment. But with higher organisms, the awareness of pain becomes greater as sentience increases. Feeling pain is an inevitable consequence of sentience. Therefore, brain complexity, awareness of the environment, and experience of pain appear to increase in parallel. As Holmes Rolston III remarks, the evolutionary process could be titled perversely, the evolution of suffering. Yet clearly, pain for us, as for all living creatures, is essential for survival. Recently, a dramatic illustration of this fact was published in Nature. Individuals were described from 3 different Pakistani families with a complete inability to feel pain due to mutations in a particular sodium channel. The index case was a child who performed street theatre. He placed knives through his arms and walked on burning coals to earn money for his family, but of course experienced no pain. He died before his 14th birthday by jumping off a roof house, the roof of a house, and all this because of a single point mutation in the gene encoding one of his 10 different types of sodium channel. We really need our pain, but do we really need so much pain to ensure our survival? The biological answer is most likely we do. Our nervous system has been shaped by millions of years of evolution to generate precisely the types of pain which will be most likely to ensure our survival. The mammals whose nervous systems worked inefficiently and failed to pass urgent action messages back to the brain are presumably amongst the species which became extinct and failed to pass their genes on to us. The pain levels that we experience, however much we might dislike the idea, have played a critical role in our evolutionary past and continue to be essential for ensuring our survival in the present. Without pain, we would be walking around on broken legs, happily going to school with meningitis, merrily ignoring fatal tumors and munching on broken glass with rotting teeth. In short, our lives would be considerably briefer than they are at present. Now, some here in that context might be familiar with the work of Dr. Paul Brandt, who went to work amongst those with Hansen's disease, leprosy, in India during the late 1940s. And his amazing story has been told, together with Philip Yancey, in his book called The Gift of Pain. And what Dr. Brandt found was that the failure to heal amongst Hansen's patients was so often due to their loss of pain receptors. Pain is indeed a gift that we cannot do without. So death and pain are all essential aspects of a carbon-based living world that displays gnomic regularity. The theologian Austin Farrow put the point very vividly, and I quote, "Poor limping world, why does not your kind creator pull the thorn out of your paw? But what sort of thorn is this? And if it were pulled out, how much of the paw would remain? How much indeed of the creation? What would a physical universe be like from which all mutual interference of systems was removed? It would be no physical universe at all." In other words, he's saying if you take out one component, if you take out that gnomic regularity, the whole system collapses and it loses its coherence. Now, how do we square all this with the New Testament's insistence that human death is an enemy to be resisted and eventually overcome? Well, with the power and proclamation of the future kingdom breaking in with the life and ministry of Jesus, physical death is shown to have no place in God's ultimate purposes. Jesus weeps at the tomb of Lazarus. Jesus raises the dead. The last enemy to be destroyed is death, writes Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. In the new heavens and the new earth, he will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. And through the death and resurrection of Christ, the whole cosmos will ultimately be redeemed, including all those who are part of the family of God and including the whole created order, so that God may be all in all. No wonder that the groaning creation that Paul speaks of in Romans 8 waits in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed, for that will be the time when creation will be released from its bondage to death and decay and will then share in the glorious freedom of the children of God. Now, does that entail that every single creature that ever lived will be raised from death and find a place in the new heavens and the new earth? Every bear, every kangaroo, every fish, every beetle, every mosquito that ever lived, every extinct species? Well, Irenaeus and Basil and the late Augustine, early church fathers, they all thought yes, although, of course, they were not in a position then to know the huge scale of what they were suggesting. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century said no resurrection for plants and animals, only humans. Today, a number of contemporary theologians, such as Christopher Southgate and Elizabeth Johnson, I quoted from earlier, say yes. Well, the answer is we actually really don't know. But surely much of the richness and creativity of the biodiversity of the present world would be brought into the fulfilled kingdom of God, and for myself, I'm happy to leave it to God to surprise us with the details when the time comes. It would be good to have some surprises. But let us not forget John 3:16, for God so loved the cosmos that he gave his only son, the cosmos. The resurrection life that Christ brings through his death and resurrection is one for us as individuals for sure, but also for the whole created order. But as for the present, let's be quite sure, without gnomic regularity, there would be no world, there would be no us, and certainly no free will, no moral responsibility, no possibility of participating in God's new creation. For God only wishes people there who have freely chosen his way of love. No room in the new kingdom for puppets. And the only way to get there is through the portal of death, when the mortal will be swallowed up by immortality. Incredibly valuable outcomes sometimes demand incredibly costly ways of achieving them. Carbon-based life is the cost of existence, and that cost is spread unevenly across all living things, including ourselves. Some bear that cost far more than others, but in the end we all succumb to the biological reality of death, God's chosen gateway to everlasting life for those who put their trust in him. And carbon-based existence is also wrapped up in the cost of the incarnation. As the late Ernest McMullen from Notre Dame University expresses the point so memorably, and I quote, when Christ took on human nature, the DNA that made him the Son of Mary may have linked him to a more ancient heritage stretching far beyond Adam to the shallows of unimaginably ancient seas. And so, in the incarnation, it would not have been just human nature that was joined to the divine, but in a less direct but no less real sense, all those myriad organisms that had unknowingly over the eons shaped the way for the coming of the human, close quote. So could it be that carbon-based life really is the only way in which intelligent beings such as us, who have the ability to respond freely to God's love, could come into existence? Of course, we don't know the answer to that question, but I suspect that even the possibility that is the case provides us with a form of theodicy in which the challenges of our present physical lives take on a new meaning. The world really does have to have these particular physical properties if anyone at all is going to have the possibility of spending eternity with God. Now, in that context, I'd like to finish this evening with a parable, and it's drawn from Michael Murray's very helpful book, Nature Read in Tooth and Claw, Theism and the Problem of Animal Suffering, which I warmly recommend, by the way, as a great book. And this parable I've adapted from Michael's text, and it goes something like this. Let us imagine that I live in Boston and that my wife is going on a trip to Washington to stay for a few days with some friends. And during this period, I hear a report from a friend of mine that he happened to be in a restaurant in Manhattan, where he saw my wife holding hands with a man whom he could not identify. On the face of it, this does not look good. On the other hand, we've been married for 40 years, during which time my wife has demonstrated only love and faithfulness, and therefore it would be totally out of character for her to be unfaithful. Furthermore, I happen to know that she has an uncle who lives in Manhattan who's recently been seriously ill. Could it be, I wonder, that her uncle has suddenly taken a turn for the worse, and she therefore aborted the time with her friends in Washington in order to take her dying uncle out for a last meal in Manhattan? I also happen to know that she forgot her cell phone because I saw it lying in the kitchen, so she might not have been able to call to explain the sudden change in plan. Now, notice something from this parable. I do not need to know the actual truth about the situation in order to have a reasonable justification that maintains my belief in my wife's faithfulness. It is only necessary that I can envisage a scenario that explains the reported observation. So I think this parable seems to provide at least an inkling of the relationship between the person convinced of God's love and the observed data of the natural evils that we have been discussing here this evening. We have no way of knowing the actual truth of the situation because that would entail knowing the mind of God, which we cannot possibly know. But Christians certainly know that God's love has been demonstrated to them in the most powerful way possible by the fact of God's incarnation in the world in the person of Christ, whose subsequent sacrifice on the cross as a penalty for our sin enables humanity to come to know God in a personal way by freely willed choice. Furthermore, Christians will also have experienced themselves the love of God conveyed to their own lives in all kinds of ways, perhaps for 40 years or longer. And given this fact, they find themselves in the position of the puzzled husband in the parable. It might well be the case that the only way in which conscious beings can be created with genuine free will is via the pathway of costly carbon-based life, with all its attendant pluses and minuses, complete with all the genetic variation that represents such a two-edged sword. There is really no way of knowing whether that is in fact the case. But the reflection that it just might be so is sufficient to keep the believer in the love of God going, because after all, the data that demonstrate God's love are so overwhelming that ambiguous data that may or may not count to the contrary can safely be put on the back burner until things become clearer, which of course one day they will. So, is life going anywhere? If we look at just the biology, we see the sheer power and wisdom of God in bringing into being and sustaining the beauty and complexity of the living world. But if we only look at the biology, all we see is that life eventually ends in death, and indeed, with the eventual energy death of our sun, all life on this planet will eventually become extinct. But if we lift up our eyes and we look to the cross, then we see the doorway into a new creation that God is preparing for all those who put their faith in him through Christ. And we realize that life is going somewhere very good indeed, albeit via a tough and rocky road for us at present. But when ultimately the whole present cosmos for which Christ died will finally be fully expressed and fully realized in the new heavens and the new earth. And that is, I suggest, the eschatological perspective we need if we are to make sense of the biology of the present world. As C.S. Lewis famously put it, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because I see everything else. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thought-provoking talk. Having now gone over it each time, and I very much appreciate that. As I have thought about this over the past 2 weeks, and as I have listened to the respondents and comments from the room, several ideas have returned over and over. First, what is at stake? You have reminded us of the connection between theodicy and science, the role of a good God in making all things good. Leads necessarily, I think, to our curiosity in all things. Whether they were made for us or not, they were made well, and so are worth knowing. Following science may not always lead to God, I would suggest, but following God must lead to science. As Dr. Lottie pointed out, though, science is not enough. We must have other ways of knowing, particularly ways of knowing about ultimate purpose. For me, that means regularly reflecting on the ways we use science, scripture reading, and other methods to form our pictures of the world. More than this, though, questions of omnipotence and benevolence have a profound impact on the way we see ourselves and the way we treat one another. If God mistreats us in our picture, then we have reason to mistreat one another, and we have reason to doubt. If God is one force among many, then why should we choose God? And who are we in relation to those who choose differently? It is the all-powerful God who ensures that we always view our neighbors as neighbors and children of the same Father. Divine omnipotence matters. Second, the problem of suffering in light of evolution. I must say that I have never understood why evolution should be a particular challenge for Christians, because of the suffering it entails. The power of the living world has long been a challenge to our understanding of God's power and mercy. From Behemoth to Leviathan in the Bible, to the dragons and manticores of the Middle Ages, to the bacteria and viruses of today, it does not take evolution for us to know that there are powers beyond our powers, that there are interests beyond our interests. Thus, the living world becomes a common metaphor for all that we fear in the dark, as when Jesus wanders in the wilderness, as well as for the unimaginable majesty of God, as in Psalm 148. Most recently, David Barish in the New York Times, but historically many others have spoken of evolutionary biology as a particular problem for theodicy. But Tennyson wrote the phrase nature red in tooth and claw before Darwin released The Origin of Species, and Job was composed long before that. Those committed to narratives of progress or decline, cooperation or competition, transcendence or suffering have latched on to evolutionary history, evolutionary theory, in the hopes that their value-laden theses will somehow be supported by science. But I don't think that's the way science works. Third, the issue of balance in theodicy. Dr. Alexander has presented us with a range of theological responses, and while I like his 3 circles of theological spectrum, let me suggest an alternative view. I see theodicy as a fort with multiple ramparts. To the west is the bulwark of benevolence, where we ward off fear of God as a tyrant, powerful but cruel, or at least apathetic to the suffering of people. To the east is the bulwark of omnipotence, where we defend against idols, anything that might compete with God as a source of ultimate purpose or value. Both sides must be defended, lest we fall into bad habits of thought. I find it useful to identify for myself, for my communities, and for society which walls seem most in need of shoring up, and when I might be robbing selective Peter to pay for collective Paul, when I shift my forces from one wall to the other. So I would ask you to consider a poet who is writing in iambic pentameter. She may be compelled by her publisher to only write in this meter. Anything not in this format will not be published. We would say that her regularity is compelled. Alternatively, she might desire consistency, challenging herself to write in a particular style. Even though she can't always pull it off, she lives in the awkwardness of several stanzas in order to maintain the pattern overall. Her regularity is a chosen consistency, at which she sometimes fails in her goals. Third, our writer might be crafty. She might choose exactly the right words for every line while also managing to obey the rules of meter. Sometimes she even breaks the pattern for a particular effect, as when Shakespeare slips into trochaic tetrameter, another form that Shakespeare uses on occasion when he wishes to emphasize a particular speech. The interesting thing for me about this metaphor is that the reader cannot tell which of the three motivations brought about the regularity in the poem, at least not from the internal logic of the poem, not from the stylistic rules which are being followed or broken. And yet, you can tell when you read the poem, often because of the subjective effect it has on you. We must then, as Dr. Alexander says, take natural evil on the chin. We must look at biological death and suffering and ask what God is doing with them. For the record, I am not able to tackle all of theodicy in my 10 minutes, but I'm going to take a short stab at the biological question of suffering and death. And so I would like to challenge Dr. Alexander and all of you to see if you can find your own accommodation without falling back into circles A and B, without claiming that our author is in some way incompetent or constrained. As so often in Christianity, we must begin by shifting our focus. Several have claimed that evolution is wasteful and careless, but nothing could be farther from the truth. If 99 die and only one lives, chances are that one has something interesting going on. Or in biology, that all of them had something interesting going on, but that one had something that led to the future. Evolution can and has, and we have seen it, taken advantage of the smallest variation to bring a population into closer fit with its environment. And who said that a life was less meaningful or less worthwhile because it was short? It is the atheists who want you to believe that a life must be measured first by its length and pleasantness. Christians have always maintained that meaning and grace, love and fulfillment, and yes, salvation may be found now. Indeed, must be found right now. No one would claim that Jesus' life was wasted because it was short and painful. And so I boast of nothing but Christ and Him crucified. Don't get me wrong, I'm not praising the death or the suffering. I'm praising the life lived. I'm not sure that I buy that death comes part and parcel with carbon-based life. I have no problem imagining cyanobacteria living off atmospheric carbon and sunlight. No death of other organisms is necessary. Nor arguably do some cell lineages ever die. Each of you has within you a cell line that has been transmitted for millennia. I spent quite a few hours this week reading up on whether biological death comes to all organisms. It's a fun read. It turns out to be somewhat debated. Clearly, some of the molecular machinery in cells runs down and must be replaced. Perhaps then there is a set span of life for every creature. There even appear to be some evolutionary arguments for why death might be adaptive, for how it could serve the long-term interests of a gene, an organism, or a population. We must then ask whether we are talking about old life with replacement parts, or new life that's borrowing some old parts, or if there's a difference between those two concepts. What exactly do we mean by death in the biological context? But today I realized that even this was asking the wrong question. We spend our days trying to defend our independence, our individuality, our autonomy, but the grace, I think, comes from that delicate balance of consistency and inconsistency that marks the truly gifted poet. It is precisely the regular tempo of our heartbeat that is occasionally interrupted by passion that tells us about our ultimate purpose. When we can see both the continuity and the interruptions as the hand of the author at work, then and only then do I think we have truly found our way into Circle C. Only then do I think that we will understand God as creator. In the meantime, we have a task. We must use science to understand all we can about the physical regularities of the world. We must be open to discovering consistency and constancy in God's works. There is a message there. I find evolutionary biology to be one of those beautiful and intricate regularities, much as I view gravity and relativity. They hint at overarching patterns that give the universe its rhythm. But we must also be open to watching the rules broken, not only as irregular miracles, but as the first notes in a changing tune. We call Christ the firstborn from the dead. That means there will be others. His death and his passion, which by the way means suffering, had purpose and meaning. Ours will too. We just don't know it yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mix. Before we open it up for questions, Dr. Alexander will respond.
Well, thank you very much indeed for those helpful comments. And basically, my response is just amen, actually. I'll keep it brief, so yeah, that's extremely helpful. I just wanted to dwell a little bit on this idea of waste because I realize it came up in that quote, that rather sort of powerful quote from David Hull, the atheist, that I was mentioning earlier on. I've often thought, actually, what on earth does waste mean to a God who creates 10 to the 22 stars? The whole idea of waste, I think, is a sort of rather Victorian idea. You have this sort of, I don't know, a kind of factory owner, and you want to waste as, sort of spend as little money as possible and be very kind of careful on how you use the resources and so on. There's sort of a good idea there. But in terms of extrapolating that to God who just sweeps his arm, and creates 10 to the 22 stars, I mean, that's a huge number. I mean, it's just mind-boggling, the vastness of God's universe, this one we know about. And I just think the whole notion of waste is a very curious kind of argument to accuse God of waste, because God has, the psalmist says, owns the cattle on 1,000 hills and so on. So this is a God of abundance who just, is full of wonderful biodiversity and creating wonderful things. So waste, I think, is a bit of a red herring there. Apart from that, there isn't really much I wanted to add, in fact, to what's already been said. I thought the point about biological death is a really interesting one, of course. Yes, when do organisms die? Defining life and defining death is always quite tricky in biology, actually. It comes into the origin of life, when does life really begin? No general agreement on that, actually, exactly. And certainly, bacteria just keep dividing and dividing and dividing, so when do they die? So that's a good question. But I think certainly as we home in, of course, on our own human death, and that's at least pretty clear that we all die, and so we have to face up to that. I thought, I'd really like to spend most of the time in questions and discussion and hear what you think as well, so why don't we just do that? I think that would be the best use of our time. Thank you.